Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Welcome and hello, I'm Alison Stewart. I'm the host of your Cut the Crops session today. And today we're going to be talking to Ian Proudfoot, who's the Global Head of Agribusiness from KPMG. Welcome, Ian.
Hi, good morning.
Yeah, so KPMG obviously last month brought out their annual Agribusiness Agenda, and that normally, presents really good insights into what's happening out there in the global environment and how it might impact on New Zealand's primary sectors. This time, obviously, there's been a big sort of framing around impacts of COVID-19. What do you think are the major things that are going to impact on New Zealand's primary sectors as a consequence of this ongoing pandemic?
The pandemic's really interesting because, it appears to us at the moment that everything has changed. We've had this huge disruption in our lives, not just here in New Zealand, but all over the world. And I suppose what I'm starting to look at and trying to explore is actually what has changed in a substantive way, but it's not going to go back to how it was, versus, what are those defining issues that will continue on post the pandemic and still be really important to us. So, where I've got to is things like the environment and how we respond to climate change. But those issues, why they've fundamentally dropped off the radar over the last 3 months, will still be the issues that will define us as a generation. So I still think they're going to be critically important. But what we are seeing more and more of is, the consumer's concern over the safety of their environment. As places start to open up around the world, people are being very nervous about how they go back into the environment. They're wanting more assurance about, is the hospitality place they're attending safe? Is the food they're going to eat safe? So I suppose what we do believe is that's probably going to be the key takeaway, in that we're going to have consumers, firstly, that are going to have attributes that are more important to them than they've been in the past: safety, health. And secondly, we're going to have more consumers that will probably wish to be accessing stuff in a way that keeps them more remote from society than they've been before. So definitely an increase in the use of digital technologies.
Okay, so let's bring this right down to sort of the arable sector, because I have to say that, we tend to find that when there's, global insights being discussed, we tend to focus on the big export industries like dairy and beef and lamb and horticulture. But arable is, a domestic focused industry. Where do you think the big opportunities and or threats might be for the arable sector as we deal with the pandemic and as we have to manage all the other things that are happening globally as well?
Obviously, in the short term, the sector's had a huge opportunity as everybody started baking at home. I've actually gone my first week without baking for about 6 or 7 weeks, and I've had a lot of abuse from my family. So I think the baking may have become enshrined because I'm being tied to the kitchen stove again on Saturday, I think. But the reality is...
Sorry, Ian, can I just ask you a question there, though? Like, you want to bake, but do you care where your flour comes from?
For me, whatever we buy, we want to buy good quality products. So, particularly if you're baking at home, I want to be using products that I know the provenance of. So, I definitely would strongly prefer to be using flour that I know where it's been grown. And in my case, I may even know the grower. I want to use butter that comes from, say, Lewis Road, where, again, that story and the provenance is very confirmed or very clear to me. So I do think, for consumers, it is important where our food comes from.
Because I think that, that's probably one of the challenges that the arable sector has, in the sense that because we're producing an ingredient that goes into a produce like bread, or, sort of it's been milled and delivered to the consumer, they don't necessarily know whether that has come from New Zealand grain, or whether, more likely, if you live in the North Island, it will have come from Australian grain.
Mm. And so, that probably brings us to one of the key things for the sector, which is how you tell your provenance story. And, that's something that actually is about whether you are producing a product that's, a B2C product that you're selling direct to the consumer, or it's a product that goes B2B and ends up with the consumer via a supply chain. Actually, understanding and engaging with that consumer is, to my mind, more important than it's ever been. We've described it over the last year or two as the sort of value web, where the consumer sits at the centre, and regardless of where you sit in the supply chain, you need to be across that consumer and building a relationship with them. And I think for the arable industry, that really is, as a domestic focus sector, and I the same occurs maybe to the pork sector or to our poultry production sectors that are also domestically focused. Actually really being clear and connecting to the consumer and explaining to them why New Zealand wheat is the product they should be looking for on the shelves, why that, the attributes that brings, the environmental standards you're using, the way you're looking after and empowering people with jobs in New Zealand. All of those factors, to me, help to therefore create a consumer preference for the product that you grow. And to be honest, that preference will potentially mean that product becomes attractive to people overseas as well. And, we don't need to be trying to compete with Australia or Canada, but there are niche markets around the world where, the plant-based products we're able to grow in New Zealand will be highly valued, and, people will pay for the experience of having those products.
And that's a really interesting point, because, I've always felt that there has to be an opportunity when you think about, the way that we grow cereals in New Zealand. I mean, we've got technically highly competent growers. We're world leaders in growing wheat and barley. We've got a really good environmental footprint. Surely we must be able to open up, sort of a small export market where people will be attracted to grain produce that has been produced in that way.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, one of the things we've been trying to argue for a very long time is that the food market is, if you're selling into the Chinese market, you're not selling into one market, you're selling into a million niches. And, each of those niches have different expectations around the price they'll pay for the food and what they're expecting the producer to have done in producing it. And the price points vary across those niches, depending on what those actual expectations are. What we've done in the past is looked at a market, because we've just been trying to push products into it, and it's just been a country to us. The reality is we need to start from the market and work back. And I absolutely believe if we are smart about identifying niche markets for our plant-based products and, the arable products we can produce in New Zealand, there will be plenty of high-value niche markets that we can find. It's just that, they're not going to fall into our laps. We're going to have to do the work, burn the shoe leather to actually go and find those opportunities.
So why do you think that, obviously there are, groups in New Zealand that have been very successful in doing that, but the reality is that there's a lot of industries that haven't been particularly successful in being able to open up, high-value niche markets overseas. What is preventing us from being able to do that more successfully?
A couple of things come to mind that sort of stick out for me. One is the recognition that actually the cost in creating the premium for a product by finding the market comes not from building the stainless steel, but from investing in the intangible stuff, so the brand and the story and the customer relationships. And I think historically in New Zealand, we've been very, very good at investing in the hard fixed assets, but not nearly as good as investing in the intangible stuff. And that has to change because, we actually differentiate our products. We stand out by the intangible things we put around the product. In the end, a mill built here is probably being built by a company from offshore, and it's pretty much like a mill in Australia or Canada or anywhere else in the world. The second thing I think that we've not done as well as we need to is actually recognise and that we need to invest time into building those relationships. And that means we've got to have people on the ground. We cannot build the sort of deep understanding of consumer need, doing it on a fly-in, fly-out basis, spending 2 or 3 days a month or even a week every 6 months in a market. We need to have somebody that is embedded in that market, and that's expensive, and it's going to be incredibly challenging in the coming year or two, where borders are going to be largely closed. So, it was great to see the government in the budget allocate a chunk of funds to NZTE to actually help companies and organisations that want to export to get the right in-market representation, so that we can have those connections with consumers. Because I think if we invest into our story effectively and we invest in having somebody in market to tell that story, we will be able to build the high value export opportunities for us.
So you've made an interesting comment. It's hard enough to open up an overseas market under normal circumstances, but under a global pandemic, that's even more challenging. Where does e-commerce come in here? Should we be a lot more innovative in how we buy into the whole e-commerce online sort of purchasing and selling?
I think, if you look at what's happened during the pandemic, I think in New Zealand at the start of the pandemic, a website was set up and about 60 businesses listed themselves on that site as selling food into the domestic market through e-commerce platforms. I think by the time we came out of level 3, there was in excess of 1,200 businesses listed on that site. So what we've seen over the last 3 months is a whole heap of people pivot towards selling via digital. What they now need to do is recognise that digital channel is no longer a bolt-on to the main business, but for many people it's become the primary route into their business. So as a consequence, they've got to take the time to think about the experience we deliver through digital, and it's got to become equal to or as good as the experience we've delivered physically. And in a way, what has been created during the pandemic now is a global food high street that lives in the virtual world. And people are not afraid these days now, rather than getting everything from the Walmart or the Fiat or the Tesco's or whatever store they've historically gone and bought everything from, of picking up their phone and ordering from 8 to 10 different places to get the products they want from the producers they want to buy from.
Yes.
So I think, what we now have, and this really plays to New Zealand, is if you can tell your story in a compelling way, we have the ability, and particularly for a relatively niche sector like our arable sector, you can become, you can use this virtual high street to make it the farmers market to the world and become a local food producer for consumers around the world that want to buy premium products. So I think digital unlocks huge opportunity for us.
Yeah, and I think that, you're absolutely right. I think the challenge is for the arable sector to see itself in a completely different way, like to reinvent its image, because we tend to see ourselves as an ingredient-based, domestically focused market. It's a commodity driven by global sort of like commodity prices, and we're price takers rather than price setters. And when you're in that situation, it's very difficult to work out how you can transform and disrupt that business model and create a new one.
Yeah. So how do you get your key opinion leader in Los Angeles who's cooking their, biscuits for breakfast or whatever they call them, to be using flour out the farmer's mill in Timaru? That's sort of the situation that we need to be doing, so that suddenly everybody wants to be using that product because it's making the best biscuits that you could possibly make for breakfast.
Absolutely.
And so that is about connecting with the consumer in a very different way to the way historically we have in the primary sector.
So, I mean, I think that there's lots of opportunities, and it's really up to sort of sectors to make those opportunities happen. What about the potential threats that we also have to make sure that we're keeping our ears and eyes open for? I mean, do you see situations where existing leadership positions that we have in New Zealand might be undermined by what's happening globally?
Definitely, the biggest threat we've got at the moment is this undercurrent against globalization. We're a small trading nation. We produce probably about 95% more food than we need to eat as a country. So, we need to have a fair rules-based trading system so that we can gain access to markets and sell our products to the world. And what's becoming really clear is that many countries are taking a step back from a global open market and thinking very much about their domestic local agendas. And for us, that creates risk. We could see the emergence of new non-tariff barriers. We could see new people pulling away or renegotiating free trade agreements. Obviously this trend started probably about 2 or 3 years ago, and largely through the actions of the United States. But it has undoubtedly gained momentum over the last couple of years or last couple of months. And with governments around the world having been facing some fairly significant food security challenges, empty shelves are never good for governments. The reality is, I think, we are going to be in a period of time where we need to think differently about how we do trade. And to retain our access to markets, our trade has got to be about being not just good for ourselves, but good for the country we're selling to as well. So that requires us to invest a bit more, maybe in how we work with the domestic industry, how we help the world to feed itself, how we think about and use the Sustainable Development Goals to make sure that we're seen to be having a broader impact than just producing food. So all of that, there is this underlying risk, but there is also a very clear prescription about how you deal with it.
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, just to finish off, and I know you've mentioned this in many talks you've given, the whole issue of, plants for protein, and animal versus plants. I never understand why we tend to say it's one or the other, because I would have thought New Zealand would have been really well positioned to be able to exploit both opportunities and not compromise, one by pushing the other. What are your thoughts on that?
I suppose my thoughts have evolved over the time. Initially I saw this huge threat and it was all about insects to me, and then obviously I've moved on from that. But where I've got to is actually, you're dead right. It's not about plants or animals. It's about people making conscious decisions about the food they choose to eat, and they're making conscious decisions to eat food because it is good food, good for them and good for the planet. And, I believe that we can produce both plant and animal products in New Zealand that will meet the category of being good food for consumers that are making those conscious choices. So, I also think the big opportunity for us in New Zealand is we are very good at producing sustainable animal proteins, but we're also very, very good at producing plants. Is how do we actually fuse the two together? Because actually, if you look at, either a plant or an animal-based diet, there's, and we've got to be thinking about more than just protein. Protein narrows the conversation too much. If you think more widely, we've got to be thinking about the full nutritional composition of food. And actually, when you fuse the two together, you can bring far more complexity and depth to the total nutrition you're providing. So, for me, it's not about one or the other. It's about the and the plus products.
Yeah.
How can we fuse the two?
Absolutely.
And if we can do that, that's where there's a huge opportunity for New Zealand to, create what is truly the next generation of foods for the world.
And I mean, and it's not only in the fused product that you might take to market, it's the whole issue of integrating the very best of growing plants and growing animals actually on farm, because that, and well, in my view, delivers a greater resilience and a better environmental sustainability. So the picture of what New Zealand farming might look like might be more diverse, and it might be more integrated with cropping and with livestock.
Yeah. I agree with you 100% on that. I think from an environmental footprint, it works. From a financial resilience perspective, if you scale it properly, it works. I sort of feel that probably the future for New Zealand agriculture looks a lot more like the future or the past in terms of the farmyard that we were brought up with as kids in our storybooks, rather than probably what it is today, which is relatively monoculture farming systems. While there be some technology chucked in and a digitalization of how we do stuff, I think we're going back to the future in what our farms might look like.
I'm absolutely 100% with you there. And I mean, we actually had a workshop last year where we called it Back to the Future, because we recognised that we'd actually thrown out some really valuable lessons, from the past. Look, thank you very much, Ian. That's been a really good discussion. Lots of good insight from you into sort of what the opportunities are for New Zealand. So thank you very much. And thank you to the listeners, and have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.